Laura Matthews had always lived a quiet, ordinary life in suburban Chicago. Her days were filled with routine: morning coffee, checking emails, walking her dog in the nearby park, and calling her son Ethan to check how work was going. She loved her calm, predictable world and had grown comfortable with its simplicity. Life had its small joys, like the flowers she tended in her backyard and the occasional lunch with her friends at the local cafe. But she had never expected that one ordinary afternoon would suddenly shake her life in ways she hadn't imagined. It all started when there was a knock at her front door just after lunch. Laura wasn't expecting anyone, and the sight of Daniel standing there, calm and collected, immediately caught her off guard. Daniel was Ethan's boss, a man she had met only a handful of times at gatherings and a few Zoom calls over the past year. He was polite, well-dressed, and had a gentle presence that somehow put people at ease. But why was he here? The question made her heart race a little faster than usual. Double quotes, Mrs. Matthews. Daniel asked, his voice polite but carrying a subtle weight. I hope I'm not intruding. I was hoping we could talk privately for a moment. Laura hesitated. She had always considered Daniel professional, distant, and completely part of Ethan's adult world. Yet something about the way he spoke made her curious and cautious at the same time. She stepped aside and invited him in, gesturing toward the living room. Of course, please come in. Once inside, Daniel set down his briefcase and took a deep breath, clearly collecting his thoughts. Laura watched him carefully, unsure what to expect. The room was quiet, only the faint ticking of the wall clock filling the space. She tried to imagine what this conversation could be about, a work matter, something regarding Ethan, or perhaps something personal she hadn't anticipated at all. Daniel started softly. I wanted to talk to you because I think it's important that you know how much of an impact you've had. Laura tilted her head, confused. Impact, she repeated. He nodded, his eyes serious yet kind. Ethan, he's an exceptional young man. Talented, responsible, thoughtful, and I can see where he gets it from. I wanted to thank you, Mrs. Matthews. I think so much of how Ethan is comes from the way you raised him. You've done a remarkable job. Laura felt a warmth spread through her chest. No one had ever spoken to her this way before, acknowledging her efforts so sincerely. She felt an unexpected pride, mixed with a strange sense of nervousness she couldn't quite place. Daniel's words carried a depth that seemed to reach past the ordinary pleasantries of polite conversation. Thank you, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. That's very kind of you to say. She didn't know why, but she felt a strange connection forming in that moment. There was something in the way he spoke, a respect and attentiveness that made her feel noticed in a way she hadn't felt for years. For a few moments, they simply sat in silence. The quiet wasn't awkward. It felt like a pause, a breath, a space where something new could quietly grow. Laura realized that she had never really looked at Daniel beyond the surface. He was more than just Ethan's boss. He was thoughtful, intelligent, and surprisingly gentle. There was an authenticity to him that made her heart beat a little faster, a feeling she hadn't expected from someone she barely knew. Then Daniel leaned slightly forward, his hands clasped together. I know this might sound unusual, he said carefully, but I've always admired how Ethan talks about his family and about the values you instilled in him. It made me want to meet the person who shaped him. That's why I'm here today. Laura's mind raced. This was unexpected. She had not prepared for such personal attention. Part of her felt flattered, almost thrilled, while another part reminded her to remain cautious. After all, Daniel was her son's boss, and propriety demanded boundaries. Still, she couldn't deny the flutter of curiosity and intrigue that his presence sparked. The conversation began to flow naturally. Daniel spoke about work in a way that felt personal, sharing small anecdotes about Ethan's professionalism, his attention to detail, and how he had impressed clients with his creativity. Laura listened, nodding, and found herself smiling more freely than she had in months. There was a warmth in the room, a sense of ease she hadn't expected from a brief encounter. At one point, Daniel paused and looked at her intently. You know, he said softly, sometimes we forget to appreciate the people who make a difference in our lives. I wanted to make sure you knew that you were appreciated. Not just for Ethan, but for the kind of person you are. Laura felt a lump in her throat. His words were simple, but they carried an emotional weight that made her heart ache in the most surprising way. She had spent years focusing on her family, her routine, her work, and her quiet life. She had rarely allowed herself to be recognized, to be admired just for being herself. And here was a man, someone she barely knew, seeing her in a way that felt honest and genuine. The room seemed smaller, closer, charged with unspoken possibilities. Laura realized that this conversation, casual as it might have seemed, was significant. It wasn't just about gratitude or recognition. It was the start of something new, something that could change her perception of her own life, and perhaps even awaken emotions she thought had been buried under years of routine. Before she could say anything further, Daniel smiled gently. "I won't keep you too long," he said. "I just wanted to speak from the heart. I hope this doesn't feel awkward. I simply wanted to express my respect and admiration." Laura nodded, feeling a warmth she couldn't quite describe. "It doesn't," she admitted softly. "Thank you for coming and saying that. It means a lot." As he stood to leave, Laura felt a strange reluctance, an unspoken desire to extend the conversation further. She wanted to know him better, to explore this unexpected connection. But she also knew that boundaries existed, and she had to respect them. Still, something had shifted. Something subtle but undeniable had changed in her heart. A spark of curiosity and emotional connection she hadn't expected. When the door closed behind Daniel, Laura stood there for a moment, catching her breath. She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, the sincerity in his voice, and the unexpected warmth that filled her chest. It was a moment she couldn't quite explain, but one she knew would stay with her for a long time. Little did Laura know, this encounter was only the beginning. What started as a polite visit had opened a door to a connection that would slowly, quietly grow, testing her emotions, her heart, and her understanding of love in ways she had never imagined. And as she sat back down, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen the next time Daniel came to her home, how this ordinary life might become something extraordinary. After Daniel's first visit, Laura couldn't stop thinking about him. His words lingered in her mind like a soft melody she didn't want to end. She tried to return to her routine, but something had shifted. Even small things, the sound of the wind through the trees, the way sunlight hit the living room floor, seemed brighter, more vivid. She found herself imagining Daniel's presence, his calm voice, the way he had looked at her with respect and warmth. A week later, Daniel called. He asked if he could drop by to return a file Ethan had left at work. Laura hesitated for a moment, then agreed. There was a quiet thrill in her chest as she opened the door to see him standing there, holding the folder. He smiled politely, but there was something gentle in his eyes, a softness that made her stomach flutter. "Thank you for letting me in again," Daniel said as he stepped inside. "I hope it's okay that I came by." "Of course," Laura replied, trying to keep her voice steady, though she felt an unexpected nervousness. The way he carried himself made her aware of his presence in a way she hadn't expected from a visitor, especially someone who was supposed to be just her son's boss. He handed her the folder, and their hands brushed slightly. Laura felt a small jolt, a tiny spark of electricity she couldn't explain. They both laughed softly, a brief but intimate moment that left a warm feeling lingering between them. They moved to the kitchen and poured selves coffee. The aroma filled the room, comforting and familiar, yet different with Daniel there. Conversation flowed easily. At first it was small talk. Ethan, the office, minor updates about the city. But soon it turned personal. Daniel began sharing stories about his childhood, about challenges he had faced growing up in a small town, and the lessons he had learned. Laura listened, captivated. She had never realized how deep and reflective he could be, you know. Daniel said, staring into his coffee, "Sometimes I forget how much our upbringing shapes who we are. Seeing Ethan, I can see the values you instilled in him, the kindness and patience. It's inspiring. Honestly, it makes me think about my own life." Laura felt her chest tighten. His words weren't just polite. They carried a depth that touched her heart. She realized she had been lonely in ways she hadn't admitted to herself. Her life was comfortable, yes, but quiet and predictable. Daniel's presence brought a gentle excitement, a reminder that human connections could still surprise her, even at this stage of her life. For the next hour, they talked about everything: hopes, regrets, little dreams they had kept private for years. Laura shared memories of her own struggles and triumphs, stories she had only whispered to herself. Daniel listened with patience and empathy, never interrupting, always responding with care. There was an unspoken understanding growing between them, a bond that felt both fragile and electric. At one point, a soft rain began outside. The sound of raindrops against the windows created a cozy atmosphere. Daniel looked up and smiled. "I love rain like this," he said. "It makes everything feel slower, calmer. You can think, reflect, maybe even imagine a little." Laura laughed lightly. "I always liked rain too. It's peaceful in a way. Kind of like a pause in life." Their conversation drifted to small, personal anecdotes, favorite books, movies that moved them, moments in life that had shaped them into the people they were. Laura realized how easy it was to talk to him, how natural it felt to share thoughts she hadn't shared with anyone in years. There was an emotional intimacy forming, subtle but undeniable. She felt seen in a way she hadn't experienced before, and it was both exhilarating and frightening. "You know," Daniel said quietly, leaning slightly forward, "I've never met anyone quite like you, Mrs. Matthews. You're different. Warm, kind, thoughtful. And yet there's strength in you too, a resilience I admire." Laura's heart fluttered. She wasn't used to being complimented in such a sincere, personal way. Most people only ever noticed appearances or small gestures. Daniel saw deeper. He acknowledged her life, her choices, her character, and it felt emotional, real, powerful. She caught herself staring at him for a moment too long and quickly looked away, feeling a mix of excitement and guilt. He was her son's boss, and she reminded herself that boundaries mattered. Yet, in that quiet kitchen, with the rain tapping softly against the window, those boundaries felt distant, secondary to the connection blooming in front of her eyes. They shared a quiet laugh over a minor mishap with the coffee, a spilled drop on the table that Daniel quickly wiped up. The moment was ordinary, but somehow it felt intimate, shared in a way that lingered beyond its simplicity. Laura realized that their connection wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It was in the small things, the understanding glances, the easy conversation, the mutual respect that flowed between them. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. Laura noticed the sunlight fading outside, the shadows in the room stretching longer. She felt a pang of reluctance as the reality of her responsibilities tugged at her, the chores waiting. The call from Ethan she hadn't returned, the dinner she needed to prepare. Yet she didn't want Daniel to leave. She wanted to linger in the warmth of his presence, to hold on to the emotional closeness they had discovered in such a short time. Daniel seemed to sense it too. He stood slowly, gathering the folder and his briefcase. "I should probably get going," he said softly. "I don't want to overstay my welcome." Laura nodded, her chest tight. "Thank you for coming. I really enjoyed this," she said, choosing her words carefully. She didn't want to sound too forward, yet she wanted him to know how much the visit meant to her. Daniel smiled, small, genuine smile that seemed to linger in the room even after he left. "Me too, Mrs. Matthews. Thank you for letting me in." As the door closed behind him, Laura sank into her chair, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't deny the feelings stirring inside her, a gentle excitement, curious longing, a recognition that life could still surprise her. She realized she was looking forward to the next visit, to the next conversation, and perhaps to the slow unfolding of something she hadn't expected in years. That evening, she found herself walking slowly in the backyard, thinking about Daniel's voice. His expressions, the way he made her feel heard. She understood that her life had changed in a subtle, profound way. This connection, though unspoken and careful, had awakened emotions she had long buried under routine and responsibility. Laura knew she needed to be cautious. Daniel was Ethan's boss, and their bond had to remain respectful. Yet she couldn't help imagining what might happen if this connection was allowed to grow naturally. If they continued to share moments like the one they had today, there was a thrill in the possibility. Tempered by the awareness that this was delicate territory, she resolved to cherish these moments without rushing them, to enjoy the quiet emotional intimacy that had begun between them. There was no need to force anything, no need for dramatic gestures. Just this connection, this mutual understanding. And the knowledge that someone could see her truly uncare was enough for now as she went inside. Laura felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. Something meaningful was beginning, quietly, gently, and she was ready to embrace it. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt alive in a way that was unexpected, thrilling, and deeply emotional love. Little did she know, these small moments would continue to build, shaping a story of subtle romance, emotional connection, and personal discovery one visit at a time. Weeks passed since that rainy afternoon when Laura and Daniel shared their long conversation. Their encounters became more frequent, though always casual and under the guise of work-related matters. Daniel would drop by occasionally to return, something Ethan left behind, or to ask a minor question about a project. Yet each visit carried a subtle shift in their connection. There was an unspoken comfort between them now, a familiarity that made Laura feel both excited and cautious at the same time. One late afternoon, Daniel arrived with a folder in hand, just as the sun began to cast long golden rays across the living room. Laura greeted him warmly, her chest fluttering slightly at the sight of him. He smiled, that calm, attentive smile that had begun to feel like a small light in her life. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," he said. "Not at all," she replied, a little breathless. The moment his presence filled the room, it was as if everything else faded away, her chores, her routine. Even the ticking of the clock seemed distant. There was a closeness now, more intimate than before, though nothing inappropriate had happened. It was emotional, gentle, and deeply stirring. They moved to the kitchen, poured coffee, and started talking. At first, it was small talk, but soon the conversation turned personal. Daniel shared stories about his own childhood, the lessons he had learned, and the times he had felt alone or uncertain. Laura listened intently, fascinated by the depth of his thoughts. She shared some of her own experiences, 2 times she had struggled, moments that shaped her, and small victories that had gone unnoticed by most. "You've always seemed so composed," Daniel said softly, looking at her over the rim of his cup. "I never realized how much strength it takes to be a mother, to guide someone like Ethan while keeping your own life balanced." Laura felt a lump in her throat. No one had ever acknowledged her like this before. It wasn't flattery or empty praise. It was recognition. He saw her not just as Ethan's mother, but as a person with her own story, her own resilience, and her own heart. The warmth in her chest grew as she realized that this connection between them was becoming more than casual politeness. The rain began to tap against the windows again, soft and steady. Daniel looked out for a moment, then back at her, a gentle expression in his eyes. "I like moments like this," he said quietly, "when everything slows down and you can just talk, be honest, be yourself." Laura nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate within her. She realized that this was exactly what she had been missing. She had been living quietly, carefully, in a world of routines and responsibilities. But Daniel's presence brought life back into her days. A reminder that meaningful connections could still appear when least expected. Over the next hour, they shared stories and laughter, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. Each glance, each pause carried a subtle weight. There was a tension, not of conflict, but of emotion unspoken. Laura noticed the way Daniel listened fully, attentively, without distraction. He made her feel seen and understood, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. At one point, Laura reached for a cup of coffee, and their hands brushed lightly. She felt a jolt, an electric spark that made her heart race. Daniel's eyes met hers, and he smiled softly, almost shyly. It was a small gesture, but it left a lasting impression, a silent acknowledgement of the connection growing between them. Neither spoke, but the moment hung in the air, delicate and intimate. As the afternoon sun faded into evening, they moved to the living room. Daniel leaned back in the chair, relaxed but still present, while Laura settled on the sofa nearby. They talked about life goals, dreams they had once held, and the things they hoped to experience in the future. The conversation was deep, personal, and yet easy. It felt natural, like two old friends reconnecting. Yet there was an undercurrent of something more, something emotional, romantic, and quietly thrilling. Laura realized she was thinking about him constantly now. Small details, his smile, the way he tilted his head when listening, the kindness in his eyes stayed with her long after he had left. She felt a mixture of excitement and guilt. Excitement, because her heart had been awakened. Guilt, because Daniel was her son's boss, and she had to maintain boundaries. Yet the emotional connection was undeniable, and she found herself longing for the next visit, the next conversation, the next shared moment. One evening, Daniel stayed later than usual. Ethan was out for a client meeting, leaving the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the neighborhood. They continued talking, their conversation turning to more personal reflections. Daniel admitted moments of loneliness he had felt in his adult life, times when he had struggled to balance work, friendships, and personal growth. Laura shared her own experiences of quiet evenings spent alone, the sense of missing companionship, and the small regrets that had lingered over the years. There was a vulnerability in their exchange, a softness that neither of them had expected. Laura realized that their connection was growing deeper, not in physical intimacy, but in emotional resonance. She felt a closeness that was comforting and thrilling at the same time. It was a reminder that emotional intimacy could be as powerful, if not more, than romantic gestures or declarations. At one point, they laughed together over a shared memory, Daniel's clumsy attempt at cooking years ago, and Laura's disastrous attempt at a DIY project. The laughter was genuine, heartfelt, and it brought them closer. It was in these small moments that Laura understood how subtle connections could change lives, how emotional bonds could form quietly yet profoundly. As the evening drew on, the conversation grew softer. Daniel looked at her, his expression tender. "I feel like we understand each other," he said. "Even though this is complicated, I think there's something special here. Something worth cherishing." Laura's heart pounded. She wanted to respond, to admit the same feelings, but she also felt the weight of propriety. Yet in that moment, she knew the emotional bond was real and mutual. It wasn't about acting impulsively. It was about acknowledging the connection, understanding it, and allowing it to grow naturally. The sound of footsteps startled them. Ethan had returned home early. Laura's cheeks flushed as she realized the proximity of Daniel and herself. He quickly straightened, and they exchanged a subtle, understanding glance. The unspoken connection remained, delicate and charged, but they both knew that boundaries had to be respected. After Ethan greeted Daniel and left to settle in for the evening, the two of them shared a quiet moment in the living room. The house felt warm and intimate, but they remained cautious, aware of the context of their relationship. It was a lesson in restraint, in appreciating emotional closeness without overstepping limits. As Daniel left that night, Laura felt a mixture of longing and satisfaction. She was aware of the growing bond, the emotional intimacy that was developing with each conversation. She realized that love and connection didn't always have to be dramatic or public. Sometimes it existed quietly in shared moments, understanding glances. In mutual respect, Laura sat by the window after he left, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. The anticipation of the next visit, the next conversation, the next subtle moment filled her with warmth. Her life had begun to shift slowly and quietly towards something unexpected yet deeply meaningful. She understood that what was growing between them was delicate and required patience. It wasn't about rushing into anything. It was about cherishing the emotional connection, nurturing it carefully, and allowing it to develop naturally. Laura felt a newfound hope in her heart, a sense that life still held surprises even at this stage. That night, as she prepared for bed, she reflected on the week's visits and conversations. Daniel had opened a door to emotional intimacy, respect, and connection that she hadn't known she needed. It was a subtle, mature romance built on shared experiences, understanding, and admiration. And though nothing had been declared, nothing had been acted upon, the bond between them was undeniably gentle. Heartfelt and quietly thrilling journey that was only just beginning. Laura realized that sometimes the most profound relationships start in the smallest ways through quiet conversations, shared laughter, and emotional honesty. And as she drifted to sleep, her thoughts lingered on Daniel, on the warmth of his presence, and on the emotional journey that awaited them both, filled with possibilities yet to unfold. The weeks had passed like a gentle river, carrying Laura and Daniel closer with each subtle interaction. Their visits, conversations, and shared laughter had created a bond that was quiet, emotional, and profound. It was not a love story marked by grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but one of understanding, warmth, and mutual admiration. And yet Laura felt the weight of anticipation every time she wondered how far this connection could go without crossing the invisible line that separated propriety from desire. One evening, Daniel arrived later than usual. The sky was painted in shades of orange and violet, casting a soft glow through the living room windows. Laura had prepared a small tea, just enough for two, a quiet ritual that had become their unspoken tradition. Daniel took a seat and smiled at her. The same calm, gentle smile that had stirred something in her heart from the very first visit. "Mrs. Matthews," he began softly, "I need to be honest about something. I feel something growing between us, and I want to acknowledge it." Laura's chest tightened. She had felt it too on emotional connection that had become impossible to ignore. Yet she knew the situation required care. Daniel was her son's boss, a man she respected, and boundaries mattered. Still, the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet vulnerability in his voice, drew her closer in ways she hadn't expected. "I feel it too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's difficult to explain, but I can't deny that there's something here, something important." They sat in silence for a moment, the air charged with unspoken understanding. Laura noticed how natural it felt to be with him, how effortlessly their conversation flowed, and how deeply she was drawn to him, not in a reckless way, but with a gentle intensity that was almost soothing. Daniel reached for the cup of tea between them, and their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting touch, but it carried a depth of emotion neither of them had expressed in words. Laura felt a shiver of awareness run through her, a recognition that this connection was both tender and significant. It wasn't physical attraction alone. It was emotional, intellectual, profoundly human. "I don't want to rush this," Daniel said, his voice steady yet soft. "We have to be careful for Ethan's sake and for the respect of the boundaries we know exist. But I also can't ignore how much I care or how much this connection means to me." Laura nodded. She understood completely. Their bond was real, but it required patience, thoughtfulness, and restraint. It was a quiet love, emotional and profound, built on respect, admiration, and the subtle thrill of shared understanding. "I feel the same," she said, her voice calm but filled with emotion. "We can't rush, but we can cherish this. We can allow it to grow naturally without forcing anything. We can be honest about how we feel while still being careful." Daniel smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to convey relief, understanding, and something deeper hope. He reached for her hand again, this time holding it for a heartbeat longer. The gesture was brief, subtle, yet it spoke volumes. They didn't need words to express the emotions they were both feeling. There was trust, care, and a tender acknowledgement of what their hearts had begun to recognize, as they sat together, talking quietly about life, dreams, and future possibilities. Laura realized how much she had missed this kind of connection. Her days had been filled with routine and responsibility, but now there was warmth, excitement, and emotional depth. It was a gentle awakening, a reminder that meaningful relationships could appear unexpectedly and quietly, without drama or chaos, yet with profound impact. Daniel shared more about his life, about moments when he had felt alone, when he had questioned his path, and how observing Ethan's growth had given him a renewed perspective. Laura listened, touched by his honesty. She shared her own reflections on life, her hopes, her fears, and the quiet longing she had kept tucked away for years. Their conversation was a delicate dance of vulnerability and trust, each word building the emotional intimacy that had been developing for months. At one point, they both paused, letting the quiet fill the room. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sounds of the neighborhood, and the fading light outside created a cocoon of calm and connection. Laura realized that love didn't always need to be dramatic or public. Sometimes it was found in subtle moments, shared understanding, gentle conversation, and mutual respect. This was a mature emotional connection, quietly thrilling and deeply satisfying. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Laura's heart jumped. It was Ethan, returning earlier than expected from a client meeting. Daniel stood, composed, but there was a brief, unspoken acknowledgement in his eyes. Laura quickly moved to greet her son, her mind racing, but her demeanor calm. The balance of propriety and emotional connection had never felt more delicate. Ethan chatted briefly with Daniel, who remained polite, professional, and respectful, never letting a trace of their personal bond show. As Ethan left to settle in, Laura and Daniel exchanged a subtle look, a private acknowledgement that the connection they shared remained intact, unbroken by circumstance. Once the house was quiet again, Laura and Daniel returned to the living room. They sat closer this time, not out of desire, but in an emotional closeness that words could not fully express. Daniel's hand found hers again, this time lingering a little longer, a gentle affirmation of the trust, care, and growing affection between them. "I don't know what the future holds," Daniel said quietly, "but I do know that matters, and I want to honor it carefully without rushing. I want to feel this connection fully, even if it takes time to understand." Laura felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of joy, relief, and the quiet thrill of being truly seen. "I feel the same," she said. "We can take this slowly, cherish the moments, and allow it to grow naturally. This connection is worth it." They sat together in silence, holding hands, sharing the quiet comfort of their presence. It wasn't a grand declaration of love, but it was something more profound or mature. Emotional romance built on mutual respect, understanding, and the delicate thrill of knowing someone truly cares. The evening turned to night, and Laura felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The emotional bond with Daniel was a source of warmth, a gentle reminder that life could still surprise her, even at this stage. She realized that love and connection didn't always need to be public or dramatic. Sometimes the most meaningful relationships were those built slowly, quietly, and thoughtfully, with care and respect guiding every step. As Daniel prepared to leave, he shared one last, lingering look. There was no need for words. Their eyes conveyed everything: trust, care, understanding, and the quiet promise of what was to come. Laura felt a flutter of anticipation and contentment. This wasn't the end of their story, it was a beginning. A journey of emotional intimacy, subtle romance, and heartfelt connection that would unfold slowly, beautifully, and thoughtfully. When the door closed behind him, Laura stood by the window, gazing at the city lights. Her heart felt full, her mind calm, yet excited. She understood that real connection didn't always need drama. It needed patience, honesty, and care. And in that quiet night, she felt alive, hopeful. and profoundly moved by the gentle romance that had quietly entered her life. Laura knew that what they shared was rare and precious. It wasn't about rushing or crossing boundaries. It was about nurturing a bond that could grow into something lasting, emotional, and deeply fulfilling. As she drifted to sleep, her thoughts lingered on Daniel, on the warmth of their connection, and on the possibilities of a love that was tender, mature, and entirely their own for the first time in years. She felt a quiet happiness she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, a happiness rooted in trust, respect, and the thrill of emotional intimacy. And she knew without doubt that this connection would continue to shape her life, bringing subtle joy, gentle excitement, and the promise of something extraordinary, discovered in the most unexpected, beautiful way.